I'm Professor Norman Markowitz, and I'm teaching this course, Culture of the 1960s, a course which I developed at Rutgers really decades ago, and a course that's changed with changing times. This is an introduction to that course. History is about continuity and change. In the United States, we think in terms of decades and generations when we think of history. But history can't be so easily characterized if we are studying both continuity and change. In our class, we will look at the 1960s as a period of history which really began in 1962-63 and ended in 1975, 1976. Why 62-63 as a beginning, and why 75-76 as an end? 1963, segregation and disenfranchisement was largely intact in the South, and de facto discrimination generally in the country. There were no real laws against either at the federal level. Blacks and people of color were both invisible and still largely demonized in popular culture, looked at but not seen, listened to but not heard, mocked in stereotypes, and yet feared. In 1975, 1976, segregation had been broken in the South, and anti-discrimination laws, based not only on, quote, race, but on religion, national origins, and gender, were on the books, and an idea, a concept, affirmative action, which really didn't exist before the 1960s, was now part of the national landscape and was being advanced in terms of policy. Women in 1963, on the surface, were praised and admired, but in reality, second-class citizens, put on pedestals, unlike blacks, but treated as people of color were treated, both women and men, as the second sex, the weaker sex, made invisible as blacks of both genders were in the workplace. By 1975-76, activist women were using and molding legislation which had outlawed at the federal level gender discrimination against women, weakened tremendously the exclusionary quota system against women in colleges and professional schools, legalized abortion, opened up a variety of jobs for women in the law, in media, in business, in research, and higher education, which had previously admitted either a small number of women or, for all practical purposes, no women at all. Issues that had been unspoken in 1963, domestic violence, rape, were now not only spoken about, but the subject of legislation and policy that provided new protections for women. Campaigns against sexist rules in colleges, particularly college athletics, sexist language in advertisements and in media were being carried forward. The Equal Rights Amendment had passed Congress and was fighting to gain enactment in the states, an amendment which would have put into the Constitution full equality for men and women. In 1963, the draft was still intact, and even with the nuclear test ban that President John Kennedy, who would be assassinated near the end of the year, had signed with the Soviet Union and its premier Nikita Khrushchev, the Vietnam War was slowly expanding, slowly becoming more complicated, and the Cold War remained the dominant mindset of the society, as plans for expanding U.S. military involvement, not only in Vietnam, but in other areas of the world, were developing, and developing rapidly. By 1975, the draft was gone. The voting age had been lowered to 18, while much of public opinion still embraced the dominant ideology of the Cold War, knee-jerk military interventionism. What one critic in the 1950s had called crackpot realism, all solutions are military, had largely been rejected. Congressional investigations of the Central Intelligence Agency in the aftermath of the Watergate conspiracy and scandal, which had forced the resignation of Richard Nixon, President of the United States, represented a deep distrust of government, a distrust which certainly Nixon, President, and his presidency had earned. Consumerism was a term tossed around in 1963. It meant, in the popular mind, frozen foods and Chevrolets and suburban tract homes and endless commercials in newspapers and on television. By 1975, 1976, a consumer consciousness, which had resulted in truth in packaging laws, support for natural foods, tighter regulation of food additives, and major environmental legislation. The first Clean Air and Clean Water Acts, which didn't exist in 1963 and were really not part of public consciousness, except among relatively small numbers of people, had been established by 1975. Most of all, there was greater informality, greater tolerance of dissenting views, and particularly of alternative lifestyles. That was the term used, which had come into existence by 1975. Even the concept of different lifestyles was a product of what had changed. Now, what did the 1960s mean for us today? We can look at the old slogans, negative and positive, drug, sex, and rock and roll, participatory democracy, rage against the system, make love, not war. We'll be looking at all of these diverse and conflicting views. But we can say that the 1960s, as a period of history, saw the first generation to confront the world of modern mass media and the beginnings of a computerized, corporatized system, national system, and to challenge